This is Windows for Workgroups, which was released in October 1992. It brought everything to build a workgroup network for file and printer sharing, and if you're familiar with the present-day Microsoft 365 ecosystem, most notably Outlook and Teams, then you'll find some early precursors in Windows for Workgroups. So let's find out how complex it was to build a Windows workgroup network. Let's talk about legacy network technology. I'm the Vintage Collector and these are my stories. So we've been looking into Windows Home Server and also Netgear Storage Central 101 recently. These two network products, like many others, came with a promise of making network technology easy to set up and use in the consumer area. Okay, those products may have ultimately failed, but somewhat 10 to 15 years prior, things were definitely even more challenging and less user-friendly. But how much so? For today's episode, I've therefore elected Windows for Workgroups 3.x for a showcase, as this will give us an easier head start than going right away into monsters like Novell. But there's still enough going around, so I'll spare the use of physical hardware, but do everything by means of emulation using 86box. Fear not, there will be physical network tech in follow-up episodes. For now, I was setting up a bunch of virtual machines, each of which is configured to connect to the virtual distributed Ethernet switch, VDE for short, that I featured in my previous episode. All VMs are identical and use an NE2000 Ethernet card. Now, if that doesn't ring a bell, then don't worry. NE1000 and NE2000 were a line of inexpensive but standardized, yet mass-produced Ethernet network cards introduced by Novell in 1987. Novell, an emerging network vendor at the time, had done this in order to overcome the pricey components offered by 3Com and IBM at the time. As a result, NE1000 and NE2000 network cards were becoming widespread commodity and well supported even by non-Novell products, and can be easily reproduced even nowadays using OSS designs. Don't worry, we'll look into this in more detail as well in a follow-up episode. For today, however, it shall be enough to say, if you want a solid Ethernet card for retro computing endeavors, NE2000 is a safe bet, especially if you don't want to hunt down drivers. It is as important as well to understand that before PCI, Windows 95 and plug-and-play BIOS implementations, it was a necessity to configure the hardware address on the add-on boards. That's both true for physical hardware but as well for the emulated ones. Without going into too many details today, take my recommendation to set interrupt request 3 and an IO address of 300 hex. Just make sure that COM2 is disabled in 86box. This will spare you from an interrupt conflict. Don't worry, we'll look into all these gory details as well in a follow-up episode.
And you're really thinking that an average user would have known this already back then?
There are 4 different standards out there, and you've got to know which kind of card is going to fit into your machine.
Times have been different. Certainly, there were tech-savvy people, and they for sure knew. And for the others, they were basically happy if the computer just kinda worked. On the other hand, it was still the times where you got like extensive printed documentation. It was surely more hands-on and less plug-and-play, but just by reading the documentation, I think anyone with at least some level of technical understanding could manage this. So let's start by getting Windows for Workgroups on board. I had MS-DOS already installed, so as stated in the manual, it's as simple as running setup from drive A. Basically, nothing fancy happens at this stage except swapping floppy disks, so let's just skip ahead. The most notable difference to a default Windows 3.1 is already early on in the setup, where it's asking for a computer name and a workgroup. As I'm installing a reference system that I can clone afterwards, I'll be using an artificial hostname at this point. We'll see later on how to change it. If you were installing an actual system, you'd be of course entering the descriptive hostname here. Bear in mind though that it should be a network-wide unique name. As for the workgroup, I just name it WFW3X for this showcase. And off it goes by swapping in more floppies until it'll ask me to install a printer. I'll skip that for today. More important, however, is the network configuration that comes up at this stage. Remember what I said about the NE2000 network card before. Locate this in the device list and when asked, confirm it to use interrupt 3 and IO address 300 hex. Windows will then present the option to choose a network protocol, with NetBEUI being the default. Additional protocols could be installed, but I'll decidedly stick with NetBEUI at this point.
Did you know that Microsoft caused actually quite some confusion, as NetBIOS and NetBEUI are actually an API and not a protocol? The protocol is actually called NetBIOS Frames, or NBF for short.
Well, whatever. Windows will ask for additional network support, specifically LAN Manager on NetWare. But as I will use neither for them today, I'll just skip it. After I had installed my reference system, I simply clone it so I wouldn't need to go through the install each time. When bringing up the VMs first time, I went straight to the control panel to change the host name. As I started with two Windows for Workgroups 3.1 machines, I named them WFW31-A and WFW31-B. In the control panel, you get also to see this important section here. Now, by definition of a workgroup network, there is no strict need for a dedicated server. So you can actually run a Windows for Workgroups network without a server, more specifically without requiring a machine running Windows NT server. Every workgroup machine is capable of sharing directories or printers, as we will just see in a moment. But this option here allows you to turn it off if a machine should not provide file sharing at all. Having said that, using this slider here, you can dedicate more resources to file sharing. What does that mean? Even so, Windows for Workgroups doesn't require a server, it has some restricted server capabilities built in. So you can actually dedicate a machine in the network to act as a pure workgroup server, albeit still running the same version of Windows for Workgroups. So let's look into file sharing. In theory, every directory or even the entire drive C could be shared to the network. But it's more practical to actually create a dedicated folder to manage your shared files, for example C:\shares. In there I'll create two folders, document and private. These can be shared by a file manager and they can even be password protected, though I'd question how secure it was if we even see the clear text passwords here. And that's already foreshadowing one of the limitations of Windows for Workgroups. There is no centralized server, so that also means there's no per-user accounts, but just shared passwords. But anyway, for a small company with just below 10 people, still somewhat manageable unless you just didn't use passwords at all. It was for certain not a product envisioned for large-scale enterprises and high security demands. Once I had all machines set up for file sharing, I realized that they didn't seem to communicate over the network. As mentioned before, I connected all VMs to the VDE switch and I suspected an issue in this area. But capturing was not possible, which caused me to recompile VDE. Check out my previous tie-in video on those details. Enough to say that as soon as I had a capture-capable version of VDE, I couldn't backtrace anything, as connectivity between my VMs just started right away and I was never able to reproduce the issue. At least, I was now able to mount my file shares across the emulated network. But not only that, as Windows for Workgroups also brought a chat and mail application along. But first, let's have a brief look at the accessories. Windows for Workgroups 3.1 was a lot less tidy than the later version 3.11, as all the network-related applications were cluttered around everywhere. At least it provided you with NetWatcher, which didn't provide too many details, but an overview on active incoming connections on any resource your machine was sharing at the time. And then there was the chat applet.
You're really trying to sell this to us as Microsoft Teams?
Nah, but a long-gone precursor. It doesn't work with user accounts, but instead you just dial a neighbor machine. And if the user on the other machine picks up, you can chat with each other. There's no screen sharing, no voice calls, no file transmissions or anything. But hey, it's 1992 and in its purest form, even with technology having vastly evolved over the decades, this is the granddaddy of Microsoft Teams or MSN Messenger. Speaking about technological evolution, we all know Microsoft Outlook. Would you be surprised that Windows for Workgroups brought along Mail, an application that also looks like a far away precursor to Outlook and Exchange? And this is actually where my previous mention about dedicating a machine as a workgroup server comes in. Because in order to use Mail, you have to set up a workgroup PostOffice. This starts by defining the location where to store it. I'll use the C:\shares directory I created before. Albeit Windows for Workgroups isn't using centralized user accounts and the account name and password requested at Windows Startup is more like an identity than an actual security feature, the Workgroup PostOffice needs user accounts. And these are created from within the Workgroup PostOffice, which will ask you for the first account to be created during this initial setup. So I'll just create an admin account here. Mail will then ask me to specifically share the PostOffice directory to the network, as otherwise nobody will be able to access it. So let's do that quickly. Now I can onboard my second workgroup machine, which will also ask to create a new user account if one wouldn't exist already. It would also have been possible to create the account up front on the machine running the PostOffice. And this is also from where I'm sending a welcome message to the new user account, which will then eventually receive it in its inbox. And while present-day Outlook has a calendar built in 1992 this was still a standalone application called Schedule Plus. It relies on an already set up workgroup PostOffice and thus uses the same credentials like Mail. But on startup it bails out on me as it can't work with dates beyond 2019. So let's flip back the date and give it another shot. And so it looks like a calendar, a bit rough around the edges but not too much different from today. It already allows you to set the attendees given they have an account on the Workgroup PostOffice. And, as expected, the attendee will receive a message to confirm the invitation, where I as an organizer will also get a confirmation message accordingly. As expected, the network integration would of course work in the DOS command prompt. But not only that, Microsoft bundled the MS-DOS Real Mode network client as well, which could also be installed as a standalone product. Now, when exiting from Windows, you would simply run the net command to start the workstation service. The net command would even provide you with a text UI, so you can manage your network shares from here as well. It shall not go without a mention that running the network stack on DOS is quite memory hungry and without further optimization fills up your conventional memory. It would go too far for today's episode, but I'll cover DOS memory optimization soon, also in context of other networking products. So far, we've been seeing Windows for Workgroups 3.1 only, but in 1993, Microsoft brought along a much improved Windows for Workgroups 3.11. Maybe as a response to the bad sales figures for Windows for Workgroups 3.1, which at least by the German Wikipedia seem to have only sold somewhat short of 10,000 copies a month. Windows for Workgroups 3.11 brought a very much improved 32-bit protector mode kernel that now also supported 32-bit disk and network access for improved speed.
Wait a second, Windows 3.x was a 16-bit operating system.
Yeah, sort of more like 3 operating systems in one, as it supported 16-bit real mode, 16-bit protector mode for 286 class CPUs, also known as standard mode, and 386 enhanced mode, which is actually nothing else than 32-bit protector mode. Still, it was limited to running 16-bit applications, at least until the Win32s subset was ported to Windows 3.1x. Raymond Chen has a good explanation on these details on his blog. Anyway, from a setup perspective, Windows for Workgroups 3.11 flipped a few things by moving all network-related activities to the end. Here we see again the network interface adapter selection and also the protocols configuration, albeit with one notable change of having both NetBEUI, otherwise known as NBF, and NetBIOS over IPX SPX, otherwise known as NBIPX, enabled by default. I want to work only with the NBF protocol for the time, so I'll remove IPX SPX. I'll cover that one in a future episode along with TCP/IP, which is nowhere to be seen yet. As mentioned, putting everything at the end also meant that the network hostname and workgroup details are asked here, which is more consistent from a user experience point of view. And as you see here, Windows for Workgroups presents itself a bit more tidy than its predecessor, bundling everything in the network group. There's a new application, Remote Access, which provides remote dial-in capabilities over telephone lines. A log-on log-off utility, again WinMeter, a more than useless resource monitor that was also present in the previous version. Also, WinPopup was now aboard, which was useful to send unidirectional broadcast messages to the network, like this statement here that I will in fact go into a midsummer break and this episode will be the last one until beginning of August 2024. The chat applet is here as well and plays just fine with the Windows for Workgroups 3.1 machines, and so does Microsoft Mail along with Schedule Plus. Many of the improvements in Windows 3.11 lay under the hood, but one notable in the network area is that you now have an option to just run the protector mode drivers and actually remove the real mode DOS drivers. Of course, that would limit your ability to connect to the network from plain DOS, but if you would need that functionality, why keep it around then? Roughly 18 months after Windows for Workgroups 3.11, Microsoft brought along Windows 95. During a transitional phase, one would naturally find a mix of both operating systems around, so let's look briefly how things worked in a mixed environment. Now bear with me as I didn't reinstall an English version of Windows 95, but sticking with the German version I already had. What I'm doing here is simply setting the host name and also the workgroup name. And no surprise, Windows 95 would see my old Windows for Workgroups machines. And if you install the Microsoft Mail and Exchange from the Add and Remove Programs control panel, you can even connect your Windows 95 client machine to the Windows for Workgroups PostOffice.
What about Windows Me?
And of course, yes, it also works with Windows Me. Apparently, NetBIOS Frames Protocol, or NetBUI as Microsoft called it, was available up to Windows XP before it finally disappeared for good. The preferred way to use NetBIOS nowadays is via TCP/IP Transport Protocol. In 2019, Raymond Chen posted a short retro on Windows for Workgroup 3.11, affirming the weak sales but also the fact that the initial release came with a bundled network card. Though apparently a network card with a BNC connector for 10base2 networks, as opposed to the then becoming increasingly popular 10base-T cabling standard. Windows for Workgroups 3.11 fared much better and was available as either a standalone product or a separate add-on package to an existing non-Workgroups version of Windows 3.1x. And of course, Microsoft didn't develop a Workgroup version for Windows just for fun, but to take a share in the networking market, effectively competing against other products like Novell and Tastic and Banyan Wines, just to name a few. Still, I can perfectly see the reasons behind the functionality provided with Windows for Workgroups and how it left some marks for many things we take for granted on the present day. So what's your opinion about Windows for Workgroups? Let me know in the comments below. I'm the Vintage Collector and this was my story for today. Thanks for watching and see you again next time. Next on the Vintage Collector. While I'll be going on a midsummer break, stay tuned for more upcoming retro networking endeavors as I'll be exploring DRDOS and Network Lite, LANtastic and even Linux. And wouldn't it be fun to have an old computer join a dial-up network on the present day? We'll also look into DOS memory management, which was essential when running in a network environment. And what was that again about printer sharing, and why do Ethernet cards need IRQs and I/O addresses configured? Last but not least, I'll revisit one of my favorite operating systems, OS2 Warp Connect. And wasn't there something about so-called browser wars in the 90s?